The soil sample was wrong. Kael Ossirath noticed it the moment the spectrometer finished its third pass. The mineral signature coming off the excavation column did not match anything in the Tessari Geological Archive, and the Tessari Geological Archive covered 900 planets across 4 galactic arms. He tapped the screen with one long, chitinous finger and watched the readout cycle through a spectrum of elements that should not have existed in this combination, in this density, at this depth. Carbon lattice polymers interlaced with metallic isotopes that the archive listed as synthetic. Synthetic materials do not occur naturally, not in soil, not at a depth of 2 meters, not on a planet that was supposed to be dead. Below him, at the bottom of the dig trench, 4 junior analysts worked in the amber dust of what the mission brief had called a dead world. Their environmental suits were a pale green, sealed tight against the atmosphere that Command had classified as marginally toxic. The classification was 200,000 years old. It had been issued by a third expansion wave survey team whose technology, by current Tessari standards, was roughly equivalent to a child's first magnifying lens. Kael pulled the spectrometer from the wall of the trench and held it up to the light. The light itself was wrong. It came through the sky in a color the nav charts had described as yellow-white, standard for a G-type star in the habitable band. But the light that fell across the dig site had a quality to it that Kael's compound eyes registered as sharper than it should have been. Cleaner. The ultraviolet index was suppressed. The infrared distribution was even, as though something in the upper atmosphere was curating the solar input before it reached the surface, not blocking it, refining it. He stored the anomaly and climbed the carved steps out of the trench. The Reconnaissance frigate Vassals sat on a flat clearing 300 meters to the north, its hull still ticking as it cooled from re-entry. It was a small ship, purpose-built for surface survey operations. Narrow hull, oversized sensor array, minimal armament. It had carried Kael and his team of 11 from the fleet carrier Unbroken Mandate, which remained in high orbit with its escort screen of 4 frigates. The Mandate's commanding officer, Fleet Adjudicator Sira Voss, had been explicit in the mission brief. Land at the coordinates flagged by the orbital scan, confirm the presence of residual infrastructure, and assess whether the planet's former inhabitants had left behind anything worth salvaging. The planet's former inhabitants. That was how the Tessari Dominion referred to the species that had once lived here. A minor civilization, restricted to a single world, catalogued during the Dominion's third expansion wave approximately 200,000 standard years ago. The survey team that had flagged this planet had classified its dominant species as pre-spaceflight, pre-energy grid barely into metalwork, bipedal endotherms, short-lived, aggressive among themselves. The recommendation had been to log the world for future resource extraction and move on. The resources were attractive. The species was not. The Tessari had moved on. Now they were back. The reason was simple. The Unbroken Mandate was part of a resource reclamation flotilla tasked with surveying old flagged worlds in this sector. Fuel-rich systems, mineral-dense planets, water worlds suitable for forward-base construction. This planet, third from a yellow star in a quiet arm of the galaxy, had been flagged for its heavy metal deposits and its deep oceanic reserves. 200,000 years was more than enough time for any primitive species to have burned through its brief evolutionary window and gone extinct. That was the standard assumption. In the Dominion's experience, pre-metalwork civilizations had a developmental half-life of roughly 40,000 years. After that, they either ascended or extinguished. 200,000 years was 5 half-lives. The flotilla's mission was to confirm the world was empty and begin preliminary extraction mapping. The first orbital scans had not been encouraging. Kael remembered standing at the observation console on the Mandate's bridge when the initial data came in. The planet's surface was supposed to be unremarkable, tectonic activity within normal parameters, ice coverage consistent with its orbital mechanics, vegetation patterns suggesting a biologically active but unintelligent world. Instead, the scanners had returned a reading that made the entire bridge go quiet. Not a dramatic silence. The kind of silence that happens when experienced officers simultaneously notice something that does not fit. There were structures on the surface. Not ruins. Not the collapsed remnants of the primitive civilization the third wave survey had catalogued. Structures. Intact ones. Tall ones. Spread across every continental mass in patterns that suggested urban density, transportation grids, and energy distribution networks. The scan's confidence level was only 62%, because the atmospheric composition was interfering with the imaging array in a way the ship systems could not fully account for. The atmosphere was denser than the old survey data predicted, cleaner, and it seemed to contain a particulate layer at high altitude that scattered the mandate's primary scanning frequency just enough to blur the returns. Fleet Adjudicator Voss had dismissed it. Geological formations, she said, mineral veins catching the scan at odd angles, crystalline deposits refracting the sensor beam. 200,000 years was too long. Nothing pre-metalwork survived 200 millennia. She had 73 resource surveys under her command belt. She had seen ghost returns before. She ordered the reconnaissance team to the surface to confirm. Take ground samples, image the alleged structures, and report back within one rotation. Kael had not argued. He was a scout pilot. Scout pilots did not argue with fleet adjudicators. They went to the surface, they gathered data, and they reported. If the data was alarming, the adjudicator would respond to the data. That was the system. In 14 years of reconnaissance work across dozens of worlds, the system had never failed him. That was how he had ended up in a trench on a supposedly dead world, staring at soil that should not exist. He walked the perimeter of the dig site. The ground here was hard-packed, reddish-brown, layered with a fine dust that his suit's external sensors flagged as silicate-heavy. Normal enough for a temperate continental surface. Beneath the dust, at a depth of roughly 2 meters, they had hit something that was not rock. It was dense, composite, and it ran in a perfectly straight line from one end of their excavation grid to the other. A seam, manufactured. Analyst Toran Helt, the team's geologist, had been the first to touch it. Toran was a quiet Tessari, thick-bodied, careful with his hands, the kind of geologist who liked things to be explainable. He had brushed the dust away with his sample tool and found a surface that was smooth, metallic gray, and marked with a regular pattern of shallow grooves. Not natural, not geological, built. He had looked up at Kael with an expression that, on a Tessari face, was as close to alarm as the species typically displayed. His secondary mandibles were pressed flat against his jaw, and his compound eyes had gone narrow. "This is machined," Toran had said, and the way he said it made it clear he wished it were not true. Kael had called it in immediately. The response from the mandate had been silence for 11 seconds. Kael had counted them. 11 seconds was a long time for a fleet carrier to leave a surface team waiting. Then Voss's voice, stripped of its earlier dismissiveness. "Define manufactured." "A composite material with an embedded grid structure," Kael had told her. "It extends at least 40 meters in both directions. Depth unknown. We cannot identify the alloy. It is not in the archive." Another silence, shorter, then "Expand the excavation. I want images." That had been 4 hours ago. Since then, they had expanded the trench by a factor of 3, and what they had found beneath the dust had changed the character of the entire mission. The manufactured seam was not a fragment. It was the edge of something vast. As the team dug outward, the buried surface broadened into a flat expanse of the same gray composite, and the regular groove pattern resolved into what Toran identified, with visible unease, as channel work. Fluid channels. Heat dissipation channels. The kind of precision-machined thermal management system found in the hull plating of deep space warships. Except this was underground. buried beneath 2 meters of accumulated soil and wind-blown sediment on a planet whose inhabitants had been classified as pre-metalwork. Kael had run the numbers in his head while his team kept digging. The thermal channels were designed for heat loads that exceeded anything in the Tessari engineering manual. Whatever system they were designed to cool was operating at energy densities that the Dominion's most advanced reactors could not produce. The material itself was part of the puzzle. It was harder than Tessari combat-grade hull plating. Kael had watched Toran try to take a core sample with the geological drill. The drill, rated to cut through volcanic basalt, had skated across the surface without leaving a mark. Toran had looked at the unmarked surface, looked at his drill bit, and said nothing. Kael stood at the edge of the trench and looked north, past the vessel's reach, toward the horizon. The dig site occupied a wide, flat valley between 2 low ridgelines. From orbit, the valley had looked unremarkable. From the surface, standing on the edge of a trench that was revealing something enormous underneath the dirt, the valley looked different. It looked level, deliberately level, the kind of level that happened when something had been graded and flattened by heavy machinery over a large area. The trees that dotted the valley floor were mature but uniformly spaced, not a forest, a planting. He pulled his long-range optics from his belt and swept the ridgeline to the west. The air was clear. Visibility was excellent. The planet's atmosphere was cleaner than any world Kael had surveyed in his 14 years of reconnaissance work. Not marginally toxic, not even close. It was breathable, rich in oxygen, low in particulate contamination, with a moisture content that suggested efficient water cycle management on a planetary scale. The environmental suits his team was wearing were unnecessary. They were breathing manufactured air through sealed helmets on a world where they could have walked barefaced and felt nothing but a pleasant breeze. The atmospheric classification in the mission brief was 200,000 years old. It was wrong. The atmosphere had been cleaned, engineered, maintained. Through the long-range optics, the western ridgeline resolved into detail. Kael studied the rock formations along the crest, pale, weathered, broken in places by what looked like natural fault lines. Convincing. He swept further south along the ridge, following the irregular profile of stone and scrub vegetation, and his hand stopped. There was a seam in the rock. It was subtle. If he had not just spent 4 hours staring at manufactured seams underground, he might have missed it entirely. But the line was there, running vertically through the ridge face, perfectly straight, dividing 2 sections of natural rock with a join that was too clean, too regular, too deliberate to be geological. The weathering pattern on either side of the seam was identical, not similar, identical. The same erosion marks, the same lichen distribution, the same microfracture patterns. Copied. He lowered the optics and felt something he had not felt in a long time. The sensation was not fear, exactly. It was the quiet recognition that he was looking at something much larger than the mission he had been sent to perform. The recognition that the assumptions underlying the mission were not just wrong but fundamentally, architecturally wrong, in the way that a map is wrong when it shows ocean where there is a continent. He keyed his communicator. Vassal's reach, this is Ossirath. I need the ship's dorsal array pointed at the western ridgeline bearing 270, full spectrum scan, report anomalies. The ship systems operator, a young Tessari named Lita Fenn, acknowledged and began the scan. Kael waited, standing at the edge of the trench, watching the western ridge with his bare compound eyes. A wind moved through the valley, carrying the smell of grass and warm earth and something else, something faint and metallic, like ozone after a discharge. The smell of a machine running somewhere deep beneath the ground. 30 seconds later, Lita's voice came back, and the professional calm in it had cracked. Sir, the ridgeline is not rock. Kael said nothing. The outer surface is a composite camouflage layer approximately 3 meters thick, designed to mimic local geological formations. The texture, the coloring, the weathering patterns are all artificial. Beneath it, The scan is detecting a dense metallic structure extending at least 600 meters into the subsurface. The structure has a thermal signature. It is warm, sir. Consistent with active power generation. Kael turned slowly and looked at the eastern ridgeline. Scan the eastern ridge. 12 seconds this time. Same composition, camouflaged exterior over a metallic subsurface structure, also thermally active. Thermal output slightly higher than the western installation. A pause. Kael could hear Lita breathing through the channel. Sir, the valley itself, the ground we are standing on. The scan is now reading the entire valley floor as a single manufactured surface beneath approximately 2 meters of accumulated soil. The dig site, the ship's landing zone, the tree line to the south, all of it. We are on top of something. Kael looked down at the dust beneath his feet. Reddish-brown, ordinary. 200,000 years of wind and weather and biological deposition layered over whatever was underneath. The trees growing in soil that rested on a manufactured surface. Their roots must extend down to the composite and stop there, spreading laterally across a ceiling they could not penetrate. Every living thing in this valley, every blade of grass, every insect equivalent in the air, was part of a garden planted on a roof. He had a sudden, visceral understanding of scale, not the intellectual kind, the kind that settled in the thorax and made the spiracles tighten. Lita, extend the scan radius to maximum, full sphere, everything within range. The scan took 41 seconds. When Lita's voice came back, it was barely above a whisper. Ossirath. The scan is returning structured metallic density in every direction. The valley, the ridgelines, the plains to the south, the hills to the north, all of it, at varying depths from 2 meters to approximately 90 meters beneath the surface. The density profile is consistent with layered infrastructure, multiple levels, internal void spaces consistent with habitable volumes. It extends beyond our scan radius. A swallow. I cannot find the edge. Kael stared at the valley, the quiet, wind-scoured valley on a supposedly dead planet at the edge of Tessari space. The valley that was not a valley but a roof. The ridgelines that were not ridgelines but camouflaged installations. The trees that were not wild but planted. The air that was not natural but engineered. Everything he could see was a surface. And beneath the surface, stretching in every direction to a boundary his instruments could not reach, was something built. He opened a channel to the unbroken mandate. Fleet Adjudicator Voss, this is Scout Pilot Ossirath, requesting immediate extraction for the ground team. The surface structures identified by orbital scan are not geological formations. They are manufactured and concealed. The valley we are standing in is a single structure, and it extends beyond our scanning range in every direction. The ridgelines are camouflaged installations with active thermal signatures consistent with power generation. The planet's atmosphere has been engineered. This world is not dead, it is occupied. Voss's reply came in 14 seconds. Occupied by what? Your spectrometers are showing no biological activity beyond baseline vegetation. Correct. We have not detected inhabitants on the surface, but the infrastructure is active. Something is generating power beneath us. The thermal output from the Western Ridgeline installation alone exceeds the total output of the mandate's reactor. A pause, longer than the others. Hold position. I am dispatching a second survey team with deep penetration scanners. Kael wanted to argue. Every instinct built into him by 14 years of reconnaissance work, the instinct that kept scouts alive on worlds where the survey data was stale or wrong, was telling him to get his people off this surface and back to orbit. The instinct was specific. It was not telling him that the planet was dangerous. It was telling him that the planet was aware of him. There was a difference between those two things, and the difference mattered. But fleet adjudicators did not respond well to instinct. They responded to data. He ordered his team out of the trench and back to the vassal's reach. If they were going to wait, they would wait inside their ship, with engines warm and the flight computer ready for a vertical launch. Analyst Mira Koss, the youngest member of the team, asked him why they were pulling out. She was standing at the edge of the trench with a sample case in each hand and dust on the faceplate of her helmet, and she looked confused rather than alarmed. "Because the valley we are in is a building," Kael told her, "and we did not knock before we started digging in its floor." Mira looked at the valley, at the ridgelines, at the trees. She looked at the trench where they had been working. Then she put her sample cases down, climbed into the trench one last time, and took 3 more readings from the exposed manufactured surface. Kael watched her and felt something that was either admiration or alarm, possibly both. It took 12 minutes to extract the team and their equipment. During those 12 minutes, Toran Helt made a discovery in the trench that none of them would forget. The geologist had been packing his sample cases when he noticed something on the exposed manufactured surface at the bottom of the dig. The groove pattern, the heat dissipation channels, had been uniform across the entire excavated area, uniform to a degree that was itself alarming because it implied manufacturing tolerances that the Tessari's best fabrication facilities could not match. But in one section, near the southern wall of the trench, the grooves changed. They curved. They widened. They formed a shape. Toran brushed the dust away with fingers that were no longer entirely steady, and found himself looking at a symbol. It was simple, geometric, a circle bisected by a vertical line with 2 shorter horizontal bars crossing the line at equal intervals. It was engraved into the composite surface with the same precision as the thermal channels. It was not decorative. Toran's scanner identified trace elements in the engraving, rare earth materials arranged in a crystalline matrix, that were consistent with electromagnetic focusing arrays. The symbol was a component, part of a system, a functional element embedded in a surface that extended beyond the scanning range of a Tessari Reconnaissance frigate. He imaged it and sent the file to the ship. Then he climbed out of the trench with the careful movements of someone who has realized he has been standing on something far larger than the hole he dug, and the hole he dug was the least important thing about it. By the time the team was aboard the Vassal's Reach and the ramp was sealed, Kael had the image on his primary display. He stared at the symbol and cross-referenced it against every database in the ship's archive. Military insignia, faction markers, industrial logos, navigation glyphs, religious iconography, engineering schematics, cultural archives from 600 cataloged species, trade symbols, warning markers, mathematical notation systems. Nothing matched. Whatever civilization had built what lay beneath this valley, the Tessari had never encountered them in their current form, not in 200,000 years of expansion, not in their cataloged contacts with over 600 species, not in the third-wave survey that had flagged this planet as a pre-metalwork backwater. The species that had been logged here had been building mud walls and smelting copper. That was 200,000 years ago. What Kael was looking at was 200,000 years of time, and what a species could become when it had 200,000 years and no one was watching. Kael opened a new channel to the mandate. Adjudicator, the surface structure bears an insignia that is not in any Dominion archive. The archive contains symbols from every known species in 4 galactic arms. This civilization, whatever it has become, is unknown to us in its present form. Voss's voice was harder now, compressed, the voice of someone whose certainty was being dismantled faster than she could rebuild it. The third-wave survey identified the dominant species. We know what lived here. The species the survey identified was pre-metalwork 200,000 years ago. What I am looking at is post-stellar. The infrastructure beneath this valley, and I must be clear that I am describing only what falls within our scan radius, is more advanced than our fleet anchorage on Tessari Prime. The material science exceeds anything in the Dominion engineering archive. The thermal management system is designed for energy densities we cannot produce. Whatever lived here when the survey team came through has had 200 millennia to develop. An adjudicator, what I am seeing suggests they used every year of it. He heard Voss breathing, slow, controlled, the breathing of a military officer who was deciding between doctrine and evidence. Ossirath, Voss said, and her voice had a quality Kael had never heard from a fleet adjudicator. It was measured, careful. The voice of someone choosing every word because the wrong one could not be retrieved. Cancel the second survey team. Launch a high-altitude survey pass. I want a visual on what is on this planet's surface beyond your valley. Take the vassal's reach to 14,000 meters and point every camera downward. Live feed. Kael did not hesitate. He sealed the cockpit, brought the flight systems to full power, and lifted the vassal's reach on a vertical climb straight up through the clean atmosphere. The valley shrank beneath him. The trench became a dark scratch. The Tessari environmental suits his team had discarded, piled by the ramp, became invisible. The ridgeline spread out and flattened. He punched through a thin cloud layer at 9,000 meters, the moisture beating on the hull and streaming away in clean lines, and he continued to rise. At 14,000 meters, the vassal's reach leveled off, and Kael looked down. The valley disappeared. The ridgelines disappeared. The dig site, the landing zone, the carefully accumulated dust and soil that had hidden everything, all of it fell away into context. It was like lifting a coin off a table and seeing the table for the first time. He was looking at a city. It stretched from horizon to horizon. In every direction, towers rose from the landscape in clusters and lines and sweeping arcs, silver and white and pale blue, catching the daylight with surfaces that were engineered to reflect and diffuse. The tallest structures were kilometers high. They rose through the cloud layer he had just passed through, their upper sections glinting in unobstructed sunlight, their bases rooted in a landscape that was so thoroughly built that there was no visible ground between them. Transportation corridors threaded between the towers at multiple altitudes, some enclosed, some open, all active. Kael could see movement, vehicles. Small, fast, precise in their trajectories, flowing through the corridors in patterns that spoke of a traffic management system more sophisticated than anything the Tessari had deployed. The valley where he had been digging was a park, a green space within the city, deliberately maintained to look natural from orbit, its ridgelines camouflaged installations that served some function within the urban infrastructure. He and his team had been excavating a maintenance surface beneath a municipal garden. They had spent 4 hours drilling into the floor of someone's park, cataloging soil samples from someone's lawn, and congratulating themselves on their thoroughness while standing inside a civilization that made the Tessari Dominion look like a campfire. He swept the cameras south, more city. Towers of different architectural styles but the same overwhelming scale, interspersed with what appeared to be energy collection arrays, their surfaces angled toward the sun in configurations that shifted subtly as he watched, tracking the star's position. Living solar infrastructure. Self-adjusting. He swept east, more city. A body of water enormous, its edges bordered by a curved structure that extended for hundreds of kilometers. Not a natural shoreline, a constructed one. A harbor wall for a harbor that could have held every vessel in the Tessari fleet and still had room for the water. He swept north, and his compound eyes locked on something that made every alarm instinct in his body fire at once. Ships. Not in orbit, in the atmosphere. Hanging above the city at various altitudes, some at cloud level, some below it. They were enormous. The smallest was larger than the unbroken mandate. Kael's instruments measured it at roughly 2 kilometers from bow to stern, its hull seamless, catching the sunlight along curves that had no panel lines, no visible sensor blisters, no weapons hardpoints. It hung in the atmosphere with the casual stillness of something that did not need to think about gravity. The largest was a shape that Kael's mind could not immediately resolve into a single object, because it was too big. It occupied a section of sky the way a mountain occupied a valley, and its hull was the same silver-white as the city towers, and it cast a shadow across 12 city blocks below it, and it had no visible weapons, no aggressive posture, no combat configuration. It was simply there, parked in the sky above a city that stretched to every horizon. It was, Kael estimated, approximately 9 kilometers long. The unbroken mandate was 700 meters. Kael counted 7 ships visible from his altitude. There were probably more. The atmospheric haze limited his visual range to approximately 200 kilometers in every direction, and the city did not end within that range. For all he knew, every city on every continental mass had ships above it. For all he knew, the ships were the least impressive thing this civilization had built. He noticed something else. The atmospheric ships were not military vessels. They were not patrolling. They were not in formation. They were positioned above the city the way a parked vehicle sits in a lot, casually. Some of them had what looked like external docking structures extended, with smaller craft moving between them and the city towers. They were in use. They were part of the city's infrastructure. The species below him did not keep warships in their sky as a defense measure. They kept vessels that dwarfed anything in the Tessari fleet as commuter stations. The data feed to the mandate was still live. Kael knew that Voss was seeing what he was seeing. He knew that every officer on the mandate's bridge was seeing it. He waited for her response. It took 43 seconds. When her voice came through, it was different again. Not measured, not careful, quiet. The quietness of someone who had just understood something and was still absorbing the weight of its implications. Ossirath returned to the fleet immediately. Acknowledged. He tilted the vassal's reach and began his ascent toward orbit. As the ship climbed, the city expanded beneath him, and the atmospheric ships grew smaller against the growing curve of the world, and the scale grew larger, and the towers caught the light in cascading sheets of reflected sun. And even at that altitude, even with the planet beginning to round beneath him, he could not see where the city ended. He scanned a second continental mass as he crossed the terminator line into the planet's night side. The continent below was not dark. It was lit, not by scattered settlement lights, not by the patchy glow of industrial zones. The entire landmass was illuminated with a soft, even luminance that suggested the surface itself was producing light. An entire continent that glowed at night, not because it had forgotten to turn the lights off, but because its infrastructure was the light. He cleared the atmosphere. The unbroken mandate was exactly where it should have been, holding station in high orbit with its escort screen of 4 frigates. The carrier looked small now. Kael had never thought of the mandate as small. It was a fleet carrier, the second largest class of vessel in the Tessari Navy, capable of holding 30 combat craft and a crew of 600. It had been the largest ship Kael had ever served on. It was not the largest ship in this system. He brought the vassal's reach into the carrier's bay and set it down on the marked pad, and sat in his pilot's seat for a long moment after the engine spooled down. His hands were steady. His compound eyes tracked the shutdown indicators without blinking. His thorax was tight, his spiracles constricted, his pulse elevated. Not panic, something older than panic. The recognition of territory. Someone else's territory. Vast, maintained, and defended by the sheer fact of its existence. The bay was quiet when he descended the ramp. An armed escort was waiting. 2 Tessari Marines in full combat armor, weapons holstered but hands near them. They were not there to threaten him. They were there because the ship was now at an elevated alert status, and Fleet Adjudicator Voss was taking the situation seriously. Their mandibles were still. Their eyes were focused on Kael with the particular attention that military personnel gave to someone who had just returned from a place that was more dangerous than expected. They led him to the command center. Voss was standing at the primary display, and she was not alone. The command center was full. Every station was occupied. The tactical team, the intelligence analysts, the communications officer, the chief navigator, the engineering chief, the weapons systems coordinator. All of them watching the primary display, which was running the dorsal camera footage from Kael's high-altitude pass on a loop. The city, the towers, the atmospheric ships, the continent that glowed at night, the scale. Nobody was speaking. Voss looked at Kael when he entered. Her face was controlled, but her secondary mandibles were moving in the slow, unconscious pattern that Tessari anatomy produced when the autonomic nervous system was managing a stress response. She was alarmed. Kael had served under 3 fleet adjudicators in his career. He had never seen one alarmed. "Report," she said. Kael reported. He told her everything: the soil analysis, the synthetic polymers, the manufactured seam, the impenetrable composite, the camouflaged ridgelines, the thermal signatures, the insignia that matched nothing in the archive, the engineered atmosphere. And then he told her what he had seen from 14,000 meters, although she had already seen it on the feed, because a scout's verbal report was part of the official record, and what was going into the official record needed to be precise. He described the city. He described its scale. He described the atmospheric vessels, their size, their casual positioning, their apparent function as civilian infrastructure rather than military assets. He described the night-side illumination. He described the energy collection arrays that tracked the sun. He described the harbor wall that could hold the Tessari fleet. "The planet is not dead," he concluded. "It is not abandoned. It is not pre-metalwork. The species the Third Wave Survey cataloged 200,000 years ago has developed a planetary infrastructure that exceeds our entire dominion by a factor I am not qualified to estimate. They have atmospheric vessels larger than this carrier. Their city extends beyond visual range from 14,000 meters and covers multiple continental masses. Their technology is actively powered, self-adjusting, and maintained. And they were aware of our arrival the moment we entered orbit." The last statement landed in the room like a concussion round. Voss's secondary mandibles stopped moving. "Explain." "The valley where we landed was the only area within our initial scan radius that presented as natural terrain. Every other surface within 200 kilometers is visibly developed. The valley's camouflage was intact, maintained, and specifically designed to defeat orbital scanning at frequencies the Tessari use. Our scan returned 62% confidence on surface structures everywhere except the valley. The valley returned as natural terrain. That is not a coincidence. We were guided to the one location that would appear safe for landing, within a functioning urban infrastructure that could have denied our landing at any point." "You are suggesting they wanted us to land there?" "I am suggesting that they allowed it, and that they watched us for 4 hours while we dug a trench in their park and took soil samples from their garden and never once interfered." The distinction was important. Wanted implied motive, allowed implied capability and choice. The species on the surface had the technology to camouflage an entire valley within a planetary city, to maintain atmospheric chemistry that fooled 200,000-year-old survey data, and to let a Tessari Reconnaissance frigate land and operate for 4 hours without interference. They had known the flotilla was there. They had chosen not to respond. The choice was the alarming part, not the capability. Voss turned to the tactical officer. "Status of the escort screen." "All 4 frigates in position, adjudicator. No contacts on the threat board." "Expand to full sensor sweep. Deep scan mode. I want to know if anything has changed since we entered orbit." The tactical officer ran the sweep. It took 90 seconds. When the results populated the primary display, the command center went very still. There were contacts on the sweep that had not been there when the flotilla arrived. 14 of them, positioned in a loose hemisphere around the Tessari formation, at ranges between 800 and 1200 kilometers. They were not moving. They were not transmitting. Their emission signatures were so faint that the mandate standard sensors had classified them as background radiation on the initial sweep. They were only visible now because the deep scan mode used passive gravitometric detection instead of active radar, and the gravitometric readings showed mass concentrations that could not be explained by orbital debris or natural objects. They were large. Each contact massed approximately 4 times the unbroken mandate. Their hull geometries, as reconstructed by the gravitometric array, were smooth, continuous, with none of the panel lines, sensor blisters, or weapons hardpoints that characterized military vessels in every known species fleet. They were featureless. They looked like they had been grown rather than built. Their surfaces reflected nothing, emitted nothing, transmitted nothing. They had been there the entire time, from the moment the Tessari flotilla entered orbit and probably before, watching. The weapons systems coordinator, a veteran named Paul Thren who had served on the Korathi border during the last territorial engagement, was the first to speak after the scan results appeared. Adjudicator, those contacts have mass. They have position. They have been maintaining station relative to our formation since we arrived. That is not debris. That is not natural. Those are vessels, and they have been tracking us. Voss stared at the display, the loose hemisphere of silent contacts surrounding her flotilla like a cupped hand around a moth. She studied the positions. The spacing was even. The distances were consistent. The hemisphere was not a random distribution. It was a geometry, a designed perimeter. Communications, open a channel, standard first contact protocol, broad spectrum, all languages in the archive. The communications officer complied. The hail went out. The standard greeting, translated into every language the Tessari Dominion had ever catalogued, broadcast on every frequency the transmitter could reach. Nothing came back. They waited. 1 minute, 2, 5. The 14 contacts did not move, did not respond, did not change their emission signatures. They simply held their positions, silent and enormous, in a hemisphere that Kael now understood was not a formation. It was a perimeter, not a combat perimeter, an observation perimeter. The kind of boundary a civilization placed around something it was monitoring but did not consider a threat. The kind of perimeter that said, "We see you, and we have decided that you are not worth responding to. Not yet. Not unless you do something that requires a response." Kael looked at the dorsal camera footage still looping on the secondary display. The city, the towers, the atmospheric ships, a civilization that had been classified as pre-metalwork when the Tessari were already building their first interstellar fleet. A civilization that had been overlooked, logged for future resource extraction, and forgotten for 200,000 years. In 200,000 years, the Tessari Dominion had expanded across 4 galactic arms, built 900 planetary installations, cataloged 600 species, fought 11 border wars, and developed the most comprehensive technological archive in the known galaxy. They had considered themselves, not without reason, to be the most advanced civilization in their region of space, possibly in the galaxy. In the same 200,000 years, this species, the one that had been smelting copper when the survey team came through, had built a city that covered a continent, ships that dwarfed anything in the Dominion fleet, a defense perimeter that had been in position before the flotilla arrived and had gone undetected by every sensor the Tessari possessed, an atmosphere engineered for comfort, a surface camouflaged against orbital scanning, infrastructure that glowed at night across an entire landmass. And they had not fired a single shot, had not transmitted a single word, had not even acknowledged the Tessari's presence beyond allowing a scout team to dig a hole in a municipal park, and tolerating the presence of 6 warships in their orbit the way a large animal tolerates a fly on its flank. The silence was the message. Kael understood it the way a scout understood terrain. The silence said, "We see you. We know you are here. We know what you came for. We have been expecting visitors like you for longer than you can calculate, and we are not concerned." It was not hostility. It was not curiosity. It was not fear. It was the silence of something so thoroughly prepared, so comprehensively beyond the need for demonstration, that communication was unnecessary. The perimeter was not a threat. It was a courtesy. A gentle, unmistakable notification that the cupped hand could close whenever it chose, and the moth inside it would not even feel the pressure change before it was over. Voss turned away from the display. Her expression had settled into something that Kael had seen on a fleet adjudicator's face only once before, during the retreat from the Korathi expanse, when the Dominion's second fleet had encountered a gravitational anomaly that destroyed 4 capital ships before anyone understood what was happening. It was the expression of command authority confronting a situation that exceeded its doctrine entirely. "Navigation," she said. "Plot a withdrawal course. Full speed, shortest route to the sector boundary." The navigator's hands were already moving. Course plotted, adjudicator. Transit time to sector boundary at maximum sustainable speed, 14 hours. Voss looked at the tactical display one more time. The 14 contacts, silent, unmoving, patient. Paul Thren was watching her, waiting for an order he clearly did not want to give and she clearly did not want to issue. The weapons systems coordinator understood what the tactical display was showing him. He understood that the weapons on the unbroken mandate, weapons that had held the Korathi border and fought 11 engagements without defeat, were irrelevant here. They were irrelevant the way a stone tool was irrelevant to an orbital defense grid. "All ships execute withdrawal," Voss said. "Maximum sustainable speed. No active sensors, no transmissions, no course deviations. We are leaving." The flotilla moved. The unbroken mandate's engines engaged at full power, and the escort frigates fell into formation around her, and the vassals reached sat secured in the carrier bay with its scout pilot still in the command center, watching the tactical display as the fleet accelerated away from the third planet of a yellow star in a quiet arm of the galaxy. The 14 contacts did not follow. They did not move at all. They held their positions in the hemisphere that was no longer around the flotilla but behind it, growing smaller on the scope as the distance increased, watching the Tessari leave with the same patient silence they had maintained since the flotilla arrived. 2 hours into the withdrawal, the intelligence analyst on the secondary console, a senior officer named Drael Kun, called Kael over. Drael had been running the high-altitude footage through the mandate's image recognition systems, frame by frame, and the systems had flagged something that human eyes had missed at the time. In one of the frames taken during Kael's sweep to the south, at the extreme edge of the camera's resolution, there was a structure that was not a tower and not a ship. It was a disk, flat, circular, massive, positioned at the edge of the visible city and angled slightly upward toward the sky. Its surface was covered in the same energy collection material as the solar arrays Kael had observed, but its scale was different. The disk was approximately 40 kilometers in diameter. Drael had cross-referenced the disk's surface geometry against the Dominion's engineering archives. The closest match was a deep space communications array, but scaled up by a factor of several thousand. If the disk served the same function as a communications array, its effective range was not interstellar. It was intergalactic. The species on the planet below them was not merely aware of the galaxy. They were listening to the universe. Drael showed Kael the image without commentary. There was no commentary to offer. The disk sat at the edge of the frame like a footnote to a paragraph that was already beyond comprehension. 3 hours into the withdrawal, the engineering chief, a methodical Tessari named Boraz Eld, presented his analysis of the material samples Toron had managed to collect before the team evacuated. The composite surface from the dig site was not merely harder than Tessari hull plating. Its molecular structure was arranged in a self-repairing lattice. The material would heal damage at the atomic level. It would outlast the planet's sun. Boras delivered this finding in the flat, technical tone of an engineer reading specifications, but his secondary mandibles had not stopped moving since he began the analysis. And when he finished, he closed his datapad and sat in the command center's rear observation chair and stared at the bulkhead and did not speak again for the remainder of the watch. 4 hours into the withdrawal, the communications officer reported that the planet behind them had begun broadcasting, not toward the flotilla, not toward any known Tessari installation. The broadcast was aimed at a point in deep space that the mandate's navigational charts listed as empty. Unremarkable coordinates in the void between galactic arms, where there were no known stars, no catalogued systems, no flagged worlds. The broadcast was dense, compressed, encrypted in a format the mandate systems could not even begin to parse. It lasted 11 seconds, then it stopped. Kael did not know what the broadcast contained. He did not know who or what was at those coordinates. But he knew that the species on the planet had waited until the Tessari flotilla was far enough into its withdrawal to be clearly committed to leaving, and then it had sent a message to someone else. A report, a status update, a notation that visitors had come and gone. The planet was not alone. Kael watched the 14 contacts until they dropped below sensor resolution. Then he watched the empty scope for a while longer, studying the dark between the stars and wondering how much of it was truly empty. Then he turned and walked through the quiet corridors of the mandate toward his quarters, and the crew members he passed did not speak to him, and he did not speak to them, because every Tessari on the ship had seen the camera footage, and there was nothing to say that the images had not already said. In his quarters, he sat at his personal terminal and opened the mission log. The log would be filed with Dominion Command upon their return, and it would be read by the Strategic Assessment Bureau, and it would be cross-referenced with the third wave survey data, and someone in a position of authority would have to make a decision about what to do with the information it contained. Kael wrote his report, carefully, precisely, with the discipline of a scout pilot who understood that words in a report outlasted the officer who wrote them. He described the dig site, the manufactured surface, the impenetrable composite, the camouflaged ridgelines, the engineered atmosphere. He described the city scene from 14,000 meters, the towers, the transportation corridors, the atmospheric ships, the self-adjusting energy arrays, the harbor wall, the scale. He described the night side illumination. He described the 14 contacts that had surrounded the flotilla without being detected, their mass, their silence, their patience, their geometry. He did not include recommendations. Scout pilots did not make recommendations. They reported what they saw, and the command structure decided what it meant. But at the bottom of the report, in the field labeled Threat Assessment, he wrote a single classification. The field had standard options: negligible, minor, moderate, significant, critical, existential. In 14 years of reconnaissance, across dozens of worlds and hundreds of surveys, Kael had never used anything higher than significant. The Tessari Dominion's threat classification system had been designed during the first expansion wave, when the greatest danger a survey team might encounter was a territorial megafauna or an aggressive microbial ecology. The higher classifications existed for completeness. They had almost never been used. In the history of the Dominion, the classification existential had been applied to exactly 3 phenomena: gravitational anomalies, unstable stellar bodies, and one species on the far side of the Korathi expanse that the Dominion had subsequently spent 40 years learning to avoid. Kael selected existential. Then he added a note in the remarks field. A note that was technically outside his authority as a scout pilot, but that he wrote anyway, because he had been on the surface, and he had looked down at the city from 14,000 meters, and he had felt the silence of those 14 contacts surrounding the fleet like a hand around something small and fragile. And he had seen, in the faint ozone smell of the valley wind, evidence of a patience that made the Tessari Dominion's 200,000-year history look like a single drawn breath. The note read, "The species on this world did not develop their infrastructure in response to our arrival. The construction scale and the atmospheric engineering indicate continuous development over a period exceeding 100,000 years. Their technology is self-maintaining, self-adjusting, and camouflaged against detection methods they had no reason to know we would use unless they had been monitoring our development since before the Dominion existed in its current form. They have known about us for longer than we have known about ourselves. They chose not to make contact. The reconnaissance team's landing was permitted, observed, and concluded without intervention. The 14 orbital contacts held position throughout our presence and did not respond to hails. The absence of aggression is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence of a security posture so comprehensive that aggression is unnecessary. Recommend no further incursions into this system, no follow-up surveys, no resource extraction attempts. Remove this planet from all Dominion navigational charts and classify the surrounding sector as permanently restricted. Do not return." He read the note twice. He considered whether it was too much, whether Dominion Command would dismiss it as a scout pilot overstepping his scope, writing above his rank, letting the size of what he had seen cloud his professional judgment. Then he thought about the city that stretched to every horizon, the ships hanging in the atmosphere like weather, the manufactured surface beneath the park where his team had dug, oblivious, for 4 hours, while a civilization older and more powerful than anything in the Tessari archive watched them work and chose, with what could only be described as patience, not to interrupt. He saved the report and sat with it for a moment, his hands resting on the terminal's edge, his compound eyes unfocused on the screen's standby glow. In 14 years of reconnaissance work, Kael had surveyed worlds that were hostile, worlds that were barren, worlds that were poisonous, and worlds that were beautiful. He had catalogued volcanic moons, ice planets, gas giant atmospheres, and tidally locked desert worlds where one hemisphere burned and the other froze. He had seen the Tessari Dominion's 900 installations from orbit, and he had walked the corridors of Tessari Prime's fleet anchorage, which the Dominion considered the pinnacle of its engineering achievement. None of it prepared him for what he had seen today. The fleet anchorage on Tessari Prime was a single orbital station. The species below him had built a planet, not on a planet, a planet. The entire world was the infrastructure. The soil was a layer over it. The air was a product of it. The water was managed by it. The mountains were camouflage for it. The park where his team had dug their trench was a decorative feature, a garden placed on the surface of a machine the size of a world, maintained for aesthetic reasons by a civilization that had achieved something the Tessari Dominion had never even conceptualized. They had finished. They were not still building. They were not still expanding. They had built everything they needed, and they had settled into it, and they were living inside the result with the quiet confidence of a species that had nothing left to prove, and no one left to prove it to. That was the part that unsettled Kael the most. Not the scale, not the technology, the completeness. The species on that planet had looked at the Tessari flotilla in orbit and felt no need to respond, because responding would have been a form of acknowledgement, and acknowledgement implied a relationship between equals, and the species on that planet and the Tessari Dominion were not equals. They were not even in the same category. He closed the terminal. The unbroken mandate was already 6 hours into its withdrawal when the long-range sensors picked up the last piece of data that would appear in the mission file. A single emission burst from the planet's surface, directed at the retreating flotilla. Not a weapon, not a communication in any format the Tessari systems could decode. A pulse. Brief, clean, and precisely calibrated to be detected by the mandate sensors at their maximum rated range, which was a range that the species on the planet should not have known unless they had studied the mandate's sensor specifications in detail. Kael was in his quarters when the alert chimed. He opened the sensor log and looked at the pulse's profile. It carried no information that the ship's computers could extract. No language, no data. No threat, just a signal aimed at a departing fleet, confirming that the source knew exactly where the fleet was, exactly how fast it was moving, and exactly when it would cross out of the system. It was a goodbye. Or perhaps it was something simpler than that. Perhaps it was just a record, a notation in a log kept by a species that had been keeping logs since before the Tessari had discovered fire. An entry that read, in whatever notation they used, they came, they looked, they understood, they left. And beneath that entry, unspoken but implicit in every manufactured surface and camouflaged ridge, an atmospheric vessel, and silent perimeter contact, a single additional line that the Tessari would spend the next several centuries trying to understand. We have been here the entire time. The flotilla crossed the sector boundary 14 hours and 6 minutes after the withdrawal order was given. The 14 contacts never moved. The planet continued to turn in its quiet orbit around its yellow star, its city catching the light, its ships hanging in the sky, its silence unbroken. Kael filed his report. Dominion Command received it 11 days later. The Strategic Assessment Bureau read it, cross-referenced it with the Third Wave Survey, and spent 4 months debating its implications. They brought in the Dominion's foremost experts on developmental timelines, material science, and threat classification. They reviewed the dorsal camera footage frame by frame. They analyzed the pulse that had been sent to the departing flotilla and concluded that it had been calibrated not just to the mandate sensor range, but to the exact frequency band the sensors monitored with the highest sensitivity, a specification that was classified within the Dominion's own military and should not have been known to anyone outside it. They accepted every one of Kael's recommendations. The planet was removed from all navigational charts. The surrounding sector was classified as permanently restricted, with a boundary margin of 40 light-years in every direction. No explanation was given to the fleet at large. The Third Wave Survey file was sealed. The Resource Reclamation Flotilla's mission log was classified at the highest level of the Dominion's intelligence apparatus. And in the deepest archive of the Tessari Dominion strategic records, accessible only to the highest tier of command authority, a new file was created. It contained Kael's report, the dorsal camera footage, the sensor logs, the soil analysis, the material composition data, the atmospheric readings, and the image of the symbol Toron Helt had found on the manufactured surface beneath the park. The file's classification was the highest the Dominion had ever assigned to a single planet, higher than the gravitational anomalies, higher than the unstable stars, higher than the species on the far side of the Korathi expanse. Its subject line was the designation the Third Wave Survey had given the world 200,000 years ago, when a team of Tessari scouts had orbited a small, blue-green planet, noted its pre-metalwork inhabitants, logged it for future resource extraction, and moved on without a second thought. The subject line read, Survey Object 4471, Local Designation, Earth. The file was never opened again. Until it was. 17 years after Kael Ossirath filed his report, a Tessari intelligence analyst named Vin Dorath pulled the sealed file from the deepest archive and read it from beginning to end. She read it because her job required her to, because the circumstances that had allowed the file to sit untouched for nearly 2 decades had changed in a way that no one in the Tessari Dominion had anticipated. The change had started with rumors. Vin's department was Strategic Signals Intelligence, a division of Dominion Command responsible for monitoring deep space communications across the 4 galactic arms. Most of the traffic they intercepted was routine, trade negotiations between minor species, navigational updates from automated relay stations, scientific data shared between academic coalitions that the Dominion tolerated because they posed no threat and occasionally produced useful research. The traffic was enormous in volume and almost entirely uninteresting. Vin's team filtered it, cataloged it, flagged anomalies, and filed reports that were read by senior analysts who filed their own reports that were read by the Strategic Assessment Bureau. 3 years before she opened Kael's file, the anomalies began. It started with a signal dropout. A Tessari relay station on the outer boundary of the 3rd galactic arm went silent for 11 minutes. The station was automated, powered by a stellar tap, and had been operating without interruption for 9,000 years. Its silence was noted, investigated, and attributed to a transient power fluctuation. The station resumed normal operations, and the incident was filed. 2 months later, a different relay station on the opposite side of the Dominion experienced an identical dropout. 11 minutes. Same duration, same clean cutoff and restoration. No hardware damage, no software fault, no environmental cause. The engineering team that inspected the station found nothing wrong. They found something else instead. The station's memory banks contained a data packet that had not been there before the dropout. The packet was encrypted in a format that no Tessari system could parse. It sat in the station's buffer like a letter slipped under a locked door. The engineering team copied the packet, wiped the buffer, and forwarded the data to Strategic Signals Intelligence. Vin's department received the packet and spent 4 months trying to decrypt it. They failed. The encryption was not merely complex, it was architectural. The data structure itself was designed in a way that Tessari mathematics could not model. Their best cryptographers described it as trying to open a door that existed in more dimensions than the key. The packet was filed as an unresolved anomaly. Then more stations went silent. One by one, across the Dominion's communications network, relay stations experienced the same 11-minute dropout, always 11 minutes, always clean, always accompanied by an encrypted data packet deposited in the station's memory. Over the next 18 months, 47 stations were affected. The pattern was not random. Vin's team plotted the affected stations on a galactic map and found that they formed a path. A line drawn through the Dominion's communications infrastructure, touching stations in a sequence that moved from the outer boundary inward, toward the core systems, toward Tessari Prime. Vin brought the pattern to her supervisor, who brought it to the Strategic Assessment Bureau, who brought it to the Dominion Council. The Council convened an emergency session. The encrypted packets were presented. The path was displayed. The 11-minute duration was analyzed. Theories were proposed. A hostile species probing the communications network. An automated system of unknown origin mapping the relay infrastructure. A natural phenomenon that the Tessari had not previously encountered. None of the theories explained the encryption. Natural phenomena did not encrypt data. Hostile species used encryption that could be broken, because encryption was a product of mathematics, and mathematics was universal. Whatever had deposited those packets was using mathematics that the Tessari could not access, not because they lacked computing power, because they lacked the conceptual framework. The Dominion Council ordered a full review of all sealed intelligence files related to unknown civilizations with technology exceeding Tessari capability. There were 4 such files in the archive. 3 concerned phenomena that had been encountered and avoided: the gravitational anomalies, the unstable stellar bodies, and the species beyond the Korathi expanse. The 4th was Kael Ossirath's report on Survey Object 4471. Earth. Vin read the file at her desk, alone, at 3 in the morning. She read it twice. Then she pulled the attached sensor data, the dorsal camera footage, the soil analysis, the material composition report, and the atmospheric readings. She studied the image of the symbol Torenhelt had found on the manufactured surface. She examined the pulse that had been sent to the departing flotilla, the one calibrated to the exact frequency band the mandate sensors monitored with highest sensitivity. She read the intelligence analyst's note about the deep space broadcast, aimed at coordinates listed as empty. Then she cross-referenced those coordinates with the path traced by the relay station dropouts. The path pointed directly at them. Whatever was at those empty coordinates, the place where Earth had sent its broadcast 17 years ago, was now sending something back. Not to Earth. Through the Tessari Dominion's own communications network, using their relay stations as waypoints, depositing encrypted messages as it went, like a traveler leaving notes at every inn along a road. Vin sat at her desk for a long time after making this connection. The Strategic Signals Intelligence Office was empty at that hour. The lights were dimmed to standby. Her terminal screen cast a pale blue glow across her face, and the compound lenses of her eyes reflected the galactic map, with its chain of affected relay stations drawing a line from the void between galactic arms to the heart of Tessari space. She did what any competent intelligence analyst would do. She wrote a report. She flagged the connection between the relay dropouts and the sealed file. She noted that the encrypted packets deposited in the relay stations used the same data architecture as the broadcast Earth had sent 17 years ago. She recommended that the Dominion Council treat the relay incursions not as an attack on Tessari infrastructure, but as a communication channel being established through it. Someone was talking. The Tessari just could not understand the language. The report reached the Dominion Council in 6 hours. The Council's response was immediate. Fleet Adjudicator Sira Voss, now retired from active command but serving as a strategic consultant to the Council, was recalled for a briefing. Kael Ossirath, who had left the Reconnaissance service 8 years earlier and was working as a civilian navigation instructor on a colony world, was contacted and asked to return to Tessari Prime. Kael arrived 4 days later. He had aged in the way that Tessari aged, his chitinous plating thicker and darker, his movements more deliberate, his compound eyes carrying the steady focus of someone who had seen enough to know what mattered and what did not. He was met at the fleet anchorage by an escort that took him directly to the council chamber. He had not been inside the council chamber before. Scout pilots did not attend council sessions. The chamber was vast, tiered, built from the dark stone of Tessari Prime's northern quarries. It seated 300 council members in ascending rows around a central display floor. When Kael entered, every seat was occupied. 300 pairs of compound eyes turned toward him. 300 senior officials of the Tessari Dominion watching a retired scout pilot walk to the center of their most important room. Voss was already there. She looked at Kael and he looked at her, and neither of them spoke, because 17 years ago they had shared an experience that had made words between them largely unnecessary. They had both seen the city. They had both felt the silence. The council chair, a Tessari named Odin Kreth whose authority extended across the entire Dominion, addressed Kael directly. Scout Pilot Ossirath. 17 years ago, you surveyed the planet designated Survey Object 4471 and recommended that the Tessari Dominion never return. Your recommendations were accepted. We did not return. Now we must ask whether your assessment of the species on that world remains accurate. Kael considered the question. My assessment was based on 4 hours of surface reconnaissance and 1 high-altitude observation pass. It was incomplete by design. I reported what I saw. I did not claim to understand what I was seeing. Your report classified the species as an existential threat. I classified the situation as existential. The species itself showed no hostility. They permitted our landing, observed our activities, and allowed our departure. The 14 orbital contacts maintained a passive perimeter and did not interfere. They demonstrated capability without aggression. And the pulse they sent to your departing fleet. A notification, not a warning. Kreth leaned forward. Scout pilot, the relay stations along our communications network are being accessed by an unknown entity. The access pattern traces back to coordinates that your report identified as the target of a deep space broadcast from this planet. We believe the entity is associated with the civilization you observed. We need to know what we are dealing with. Kael looked at the galactic map displayed on the chamber floor. The chain of compromised relay stations was highlighted in red. 47 points of light, tracing a path through the Dominion's infrastructure like a thread pulled through fabric. You are dealing with a species that built a planet, Kael said. They engineered their own atmosphere. They camouflaged their civilization against orbital detection. They maintained passive surveillance of our fleet using vessels we could not detect with our best sensors. Their material science exceeds ours by a margin I could not quantify, and their energy technology operates at densities our physics does not account for. They have had 200,000 years to develop, and based on what I observed, they have been aware of the Tessari Dominion for a significant portion of that time. He paused. The chamber was silent, 300 officials waiting. What you are dealing with, Kael continued, is a species that does not need to attack your relay stations. If they wanted to disable your communications network, it would already be disabled. They are not probing your infrastructure for weaknesses. They are using it. The encrypted packets are not weapons. They are mail. Someone on the far end of those coordinates is corresponding with someone on Earth, and they are routing the conversation through your relay stations because your relay stations happen to be in the way, and it was more convenient to use them than to go around. The silence that followed this statement was the deepest Kael had ever experienced in a room full of people. It was not the silence of shock or fear. It was the silence of recalibration. 300 of the most powerful individuals in the Tessari Dominion, absorbing the possibility that their entire communications infrastructure, the network that bound their civilization together across 4 galactic arms, was being used as a postal service by a species that had not even bothered to ask permission. Odin Kreth spoke carefully. You are telling us they are not interested in the Tessari Dominion. I am telling you they are not threatened by the Tessari Dominion. There is a difference. They are aware of you. They have been aware of you for longer than your own records go back. They know your sensor frequencies, your military classifications, your relay station locations, your encryption standards. They know these things not because they stole them, but because knowing them is trivial for a civilization at their level of development. You are inside their field of vision. You have always been inside their field of vision, and they have decided for 200,000 years that you do not require a response. Until now, Voss said. She had been standing off to the side listening. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had spent 17 years thinking about a city that stretched to every horizon. The relay incursions are new. Something has changed. Kael nodded slowly. Something has changed, not about us, about them. The broadcast they sent 17 years ago was aimed at a point in deep space, and now something at that point is sending messages back through our relay network. They are not talking to us. They are talking to each other, and the conversation has gotten closer. Closer to what? Kreth asked. Closer to here. The relay path is moving inward, toward the core systems, toward Tessari Prime. Kreth's mandibles tightened. Around the chamber, 300 sets of secondary mandibles pressed flat against 300 jaws in the unconscious Tessari stress response that Kael had seen on Toran's face in the trench 17 years ago. Are they coming here? Kael looked at the map again, the chain of red dots, the path through the Dominion. He thought about the 14 silent contacts that had surrounded the flotilla. The patience. The silence that was not silence at all, but a statement so complete it did not require words. "No," he said. "They are not coming here. They are already everywhere they want to be. The relay incursions are not a fleet moving toward you. They are a conversation passing through you. When it is finished, the dropouts will stop. The encrypted packets will remain in your station buffers. You will never decrypt them. And the path will not matter because the path was never about the Tessari Dominion. It was about 2 points in space communicating through the most efficient available medium, and you happen to have built relay stations along the most efficient route." He stopped speaking. The chamber processed. Voss was watching Kael with an expression he remembered from the command center of the Unbroken Mandate. The expression of someone who understood that the world they had built their career in was smaller than they had believed. Kreth asked the question that the entire chamber was thinking: "What do we do?" Kael answered without hesitation, because he had been carrying the answer for 17 years, since the moment he had looked down from 14,000 meters and understood what he was seeing. "Nothing." The word hung in the chamber like a held breath. "You do nothing," Kael repeated. "You do not confront them. You do not attempt to decrypt their communications. You do not send another fleet to their system. You do not attempt to contact them, because they already know everything you could tell them and they have chosen not to respond. You maintain your restricted zone. You continue your operations. You build your stations and expand your territory and develop your technology. And you accept that the galaxy contains at least one civilization that has moved beyond the stage where interaction with the Tessari Dominion serves any purpose for them." He looked around the chamber. 300 officials, the leadership of a dominion that spanned 4 galactic arms and considered itself the most advanced civilization in its region of space. "Your dominion has existed for 200,000 years, Kael said. "That is a long time. Long enough to build 900 planetary installations and catalog 600 species and fight 11 border wars and develop the most comprehensive archive in your experience. But the species on that planet has existed for longer. They were there before your first expansion wave. They will be there after your last. They are not your rivals. They are not your enemies. They are not your allies. They are a feature of the galaxy, like gravity, like starlight, like the distance between worlds. You do not negotiate with gravity. You do not confront starlight. You account for them, and you build within the constraints they impose, and you continue." Kael Ossirath finished speaking. He stood in the center of the council chamber, a retired scout pilot who had spent 4 hours in a trench on someone else's planet and had carried what he found there for the rest of his life. The council did not dismiss him. They did not ask follow-up questions. They sat with what he had said, the way Boraz Eld had sat in the observation chair on the Mandate and stared at the bulkhead, because some pieces of information were too large to respond to immediately and needed to be absorbed before they could be addressed. The relay incursions continued for another 6 months. 63 stations total were affected. The encrypted packets accumulated in the station buffers, indecipherable, occupying a trivial amount of storage space. Then the incursion stopped, cleanly, all at once, as though a conversation had ended and the participants had hung up. The Dominion Council accepted Kael's recommendations, all of them. No decryption attempts, no follow-up surveys, no contact missions. The restricted zone around Earth was expanded to 60 light-years in every direction. The relay station data was classified at the same level as Kael's original report. The third-wave survey file remained sealed. The resource reclamation flotilla's mission log remained classified. The encrypted packets remained in the station buffers, unread and unreadable. And in the deepest archive of the Tessari Dominion's strategic records, Kael's original file sat beside a new companion document. A second assessment, written 17 years after the first, by the same scout pilot with the same careful precision. The threat classification remained existential. He did not change it, but beneath it, in the remarks field, he added a single line that reframed everything the Dominion thought it knew about its place in the galaxy. They are not a threat. They are the reason the galaxy is quiet. Vindoreth was the analyst who filed the companion document. She sealed the archive with the appropriate classifications and returned to her desk. She sat in the dim light of the Strategic Signals Intelligence Office, alone, and thought about a species that had been smelting copper when the Tessari first found them. A species that had built a world and a silence and a patience that spanned 200 millennia. A species that rooted its conversations through other civilizations, infrastructure the way. A river flowed through a landscape, not maliciously, not carelessly, but inevitably, because the river was larger than the landscape, and the landscape had been built inside its path without knowing it. She thought about the symbol Toran Helt had found engraved in the manufactured surface, the circle bisected by a vertical line, crossed by two horizontal bars, no match in any archive, an emblem of a civilization that had outgrown the need to be known. She thought about the 14 silent contacts that had surrounded the Tessari flotilla like a cupped hand around a moth, the hand that never closed, the patience that never broke, the silence that was not indifference but certainty, the certainty of a species that had seen civilizations like the Tessari rise and expand, and reach their limits and settle, over and over, across the long quiet of galactic time, and had decided that the kindest thing to do was simply to let them. Vin closed her terminal and went home. She never spoke publicly about what she had read. Neither did Kael. Neither did Voss. The three of them, the scout pilot who had dug in someone's park, the fleet adjudicator who had ordered the withdrawal, and the intelligence analyst who had connected the relay dropouts to a planet that should have been dead, carried the knowledge separately in their own ways for the rest of their careers. They did not form a committee. They did not write a joint assessment. They did not become friends. But each of them in the years that followed made decisions that were shaped by the same understanding. An understanding that the galaxy was not empty, that it had never been empty. That somewhere in the quiet between the stars, a species that had once been primitive and violent and confined to a single fragile world, had taken the long road from copper smelting to planetary engineering. And they had done it so thoroughly, so completely, and so quietly that the oldest and most powerful interstellar civilization in the region had not noticed until it was already finished. The Dominion's historians would later identify the Earth file as the single most consequential intelligence product in Tessari history. Not because it changed policy, not because it triggered a war or a treaty or a technological revolution, but because it introduced a concept that the Tessari had never been forced to confront, the concept of irrelevance. The Dominion had spent 200,000 years operating under the assumption that it was the most significant political and technological entity in its region of space. The Earth file did not challenge that assumption. It dismantled it, not with aggression, not with demands. With silence, with the quiet, immovable fact that the galaxy contained at least one civilization that regarded the Tessari Dominion the way the Dominion regarded the pre-metalwork species in its archive, with patience, with tolerance, with the unspoken understanding that growth was something every species had to do at its own pace, and that interference served no purpose except to demonstrate insecurity. The galaxy continued, the Tessari Dominion continued, their stations operated, their fleets patrolled, their borders held, their archive grew. And somewhere, on a blue-green planet orbiting a yellow star in a quiet arm of the galaxy, a city that stretched to every horizon caught the morning light, and ships hung in the atmosphere like weather, and an entire world hummed with the quiet machinery of a civilization that had been building for 200,000 years, and had never once felt the need to announce what it had become. They did not need to. The silence said everything,